From the Radio Cafe and the Quivira Coalition, you're listening to Down to Earth, the Planet to Plate podcast. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. We've got a very interesting topic today. It's all about carbon credits, carbon offsets. What are they? How do they work? And how can they, or do they, incentivize regenerative agriculture? We'll hear all about that right after this announcement. Save the dates for New Mexico and Colorado coalitions to enhance working lands annual summits happening on February 29th in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, and March 21st in Alamosa, Colorado. The summits convene agency and nonprofit staff, private sector professionals, ranchers, farmers, and others for an in-person gathering on collaboration in land stewardship. This year's focus is on agricultural supply chains, from soil health to the processes that bring food and fiber into our communities, and the collaborations that support their strength. It's free to attend, and registration is at nmcewl.org, that's for New Mexico, and cocewl.org for Colorado. I'd like now to introduce Jane Zelikova. She's an ecosystem scientist who works at the intersection of climate change science and policy. She's director of the Soil Carbon Solution Center at Colorado State University, and she's a board member of the Quivira Coalition. She's co-leading a 4-part webinar every Tuesday from February 20th through March 12th, co-sponsored by the Quivira Coalition and the Soil Carbon Solutions Center. It's a free webinar called Unpacking the Carbon Credit Conundrum, and it's for farmers and ranchers and anyone else who wants to learn about the realities and economics of carbon credits. Welcome, Jane, to Down to Earth.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on the program. So we know that there's an excess of greenhouse gas emissions in our atmosphere. We know that this is caused in large part by the burning of fossil fuels. And there are many efforts underway to reduce emissions through renewable energy generation and also to remove carbon from the atmosphere in various ways, both technological and nature-based. One of the tools that's been invented to incentivize clean energy and carbon removal is called carbon credits. Tell us what carbon credits are. Who buys them? Who sells them? What is this market?
Yeah, so carbon credits are the result of essentially a financing mechanism by which a credit is generated from an activity that reduces or removes or avoids the emission of 1 ton of credit. And that 1 ton of credit is equivalent to 1 carbon credit.
1 ton of carbon?
1 ton of CO2 equivalent. So that could be, the reason we use CO2 equivalents is because sometimes the emissions come in the form of something like methane. And so we have a conversion system that converts methane into CO2 equivalents so that everything is being measured in the same units. So an activity like increasing energy efficiency of a building would reduce the emissions associated with running that building, and you could calculate how much that is and generate carbon credits that are equivalent to the number of carbon units that are reduced through energy efficiency. Another example would be if you plant a bunch of trees and they remove carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, we have the means to measure how much carbon is being removed, and we can generate carbon credits that are equivalent to the amount of carbon that the plants are sequestering or removing from the atmosphere. So it is this idea that there is a credit that is associated with some activity that reduces, removes, or avoids an emission of CO2. And it is generated and then given to an emitting entity. So on the other side of the equation, we have emitters who are doing activities that emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere or methane. And so when they are not able to directly reduce or eliminate the emissions associated with their activities, they can purchase these carbon credits, or carbon offsets is another way of saying it, that are generated by some activities somewhere else that have, either removed, avoided, or reduced emissions.
So the idea is that, for example, an airline that's emitting X and so many tons of carbon per airline flight buys these carbon credits or offsets that basically make them, hopefully, carbon neutral.
That's actually a more challenging example, but yes. So basically, when you're purchasing an airline ticket these days, you're given the option to also purchase carbon offset credits that are associated with your flight. So that's usually on top of the price of the ticket. But those carbon offsets usually are equal to the carbon dioxide that is associated with the flight that you've taken. And airlines purchase those credits in bulk from various carbon projects that are generating carbon offsets. So that's one example. Another one could be you have an industrial facility that is directly emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and they're not able to reduce those emissions quickly enough to meet a particular goal. So they buy carbon offsets in the meantime to make up the difference between what they're able to directly reduce and what their actual reduction goal is.
So what are some of the examples of actual on-the-ground carbon sequestration or carbon reduction projects that these folks who are selling carbon credits, carbon offsets are, what are the actual projects that are removing carbon?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there are over 170 different types of carbon credits that exist in the world. And they can come from projects that, distribute cook stoves to people living in Kenya and replacing biomass burning as a means of cooking food and creating heat and boiling water. They could also be replacing existing inefficient appliances with more efficient appliances can generate credits. Planting trees or managing forests better can generate credits. Managing agricultural lands is another example of generating carbon credits. There's also credits in renewable energy like wind and geothermal and solar, although those are less common these days. And certainly energy efficiency, switching from high energy fuels to lower energy fuels, recycling various materials. The number of types of projects that can generate a carbon credit is actually really high, and only a few of those projects are in the agricultural sector.
Yeah, and of course we're talking about it today because, our audience are people who are doing or who are interested in regenerative agriculture. And, I was thinking about it. I mean, our, what you might call dominant industrial and political culture tends to believe that we can engineer our way out of problems with ever more sophisticated technology, whatever those problems may be. And some of the solutions, some of the carbon offsets are based in technology, and some of them are really nature-based, like regenerative ag and forestry and things like that. Do you have a sense of how much of this carbon credit world is in fact geared toward nature-based solutions?
Yeah, so I think there's actually there's an important distinction between different types of carbon markets. So there's voluntary carbon markets, which are the ones that, airline companies are buying offsets from, et cetera. And then there's compliance or regulatory markets, where there is a regulatory mechanism in place that forces a particular industry to reduce their emissions and gives some small percentage of emissions that can be sort of met with offsets. And so there's a difference between regulatory and voluntary carbon markets. In the voluntary carbon market space, which is kind of rapidly growing right now, nature-based carbon credits are actually the bulk of what is traded. They're also what is referred to as charismatic carbon. It's, really nice to think about, managing forests better, tropical forests, or beautiful agricultural lands that are being managed better. People want to buy those credits. People want to connect with the land in that way. So those nature-based carbon markets have been growing really rapidly over the last few years. And the bulk of the credits that are being traded are actually in the nature-based space.
And so when we talk about the voluntary space, how much of a difference does that make? I read somewhere that something like 10% of emitters are actually getting involved in this voluntary carbon market world. And I think it varies a great deal state by state how much mandatory regulation there is on emitters. So what does that actually look like in real numbers?
Yeah, I think it's a real patchwork in the U.S. There are a few states that have compliance markets and also trading sort of schemes that allow regulated industries to actually purchase carbon offsets. And there's rules about what kind of offsets can be purchased and how much of that can be purchased out of state versus in state. One example that probably your listeners would not be surprised about is that California has one of these kinds of regulated markets and trading schemes. And on the other side, the voluntary space is growing a lot, and most companies most large and even mid-sized companies have made some sort of climate commitments and have been trying to meet those commitments largely by purchasing offsets. Because reducing emissions is very challenging, and in the meantime, as companies are trying to develop strategies for how they're going to meet their climate goals, they're buying offsets of various quality and various types of projects. So there is kind of a general public drive towards having climate commitments and being held accountable, at least to some degree, to making sure that companies are moving towards meeting climate goals. But in the meantime, without having the means to really reduce emissions, most companies are buying a lot of offsets.
This is, capitalist America, and there's a lot of money coming into this space. I mean, as you say, it's a growing market. Who's getting rich or trying to get rich off of all of this? And where does that leave, for example, farmers and people who are really doing nature-based solutions? I'm going to kind of guess that they're not really reaping the benefits, or are they?
I think it's a really mixed landscape. So I will say on the carbon market side, there's a lot of investment and money that was and still is flowing into carbon markets, carbon project developers, companies that are being stood up to evaluate the quality of various carbon projects and advise buyers on what they should and shouldn't buy. There are companies being stood up to measure things. One name for things that you might see in the space is MRV, which is measurement, reporting, and verification. So there are a lot of companies that are kind of being stood up to help measure carbon footprinting, carbon that is being emitted through the supply chain of large companies. So there's a lot of activity in the space, and a lot of it is kind of going to the middlemen, the entities that help transact between the production of carbon credits and the purchase of carbon credits. I would say the bulk of the investment and activity is actually in this middle space. But there are a lot of carbon project developers. These are people that are working directly with landowners, for example, to develop carbon projects. And then on the buy side, you have either large companies or some sort of intermediaries that are buying credits and then distributing them. So there's a lot of money flowing through, and only a small portion of it is reaching the actual land managers, producers, farmers, and ranchers on the ag side. A lot of it is kind of gets sucked out in the middle through all these middlemen, verification companies, quality assurance companies, measurement companies, etc.
I mean, it sounds like the food system itself, where farmers and ranchers really are getting a small amount of the percentage of like $1 of food sold. They're getting pennies or nickels of that. And it sounds like the same thing.
It's pretty similar. That's not always the case. There are some project developers that allocate more of the percentage of the money to the producer, but it's not always clear, and we don't always have insight into contracts to see how much the producer is actually getting. So the marketing materials don't always meet the actual realities when you take into account the actual sequestration rates that are measured and possible for a particular project relative to what is being promised on the brochure. And so often, and some of the other folks here at CSU have done research on this in agricultural economics department, have looked at sequestration rates that large project developers quote and sort of put in their marketing materials relative to what is actually possible and what we find when we look at their project verification documentation, which is sequestration rates that are much lower. And if you think about a price per ton, so let's say project developer A is going to pay $50 per ton of carbon sequestered. That means that if you sequester a ton on your acre, then you get the $50. But in reality, sequestration rates are much, much, much lower. And so the expectation doesn't meet the reality once the team goes out to actually measure the soil carbon sequestered, and the payments are much lower, for example. That's one way that the payment doesn't meet the promise. Another is that there are costs that are subtracted from that cost. So $50 a ton, but then there are all these costs, including measurement costs, et cetera, that are taken out of that. And so the producer sees a much lower percentage than what is quoted in the marketing materials. And it varies from company to company. They're not all the same.
That's so interesting. I mean, and this is the reason that you at the Soil Carbon Solution Center and the Quivira Coalition are doing this webinar unpacking the carbon credit conundrum because, we have a situation where people are literally showing up at the doors of the houses of farmers and ranchers and trying to get them involved. And, we talk a lot on this show about how sequestering carbon permanently in the soil through regenerative agricultural practices like, cultivating soil health and biodiversity and reducing synthetic farm chemicals is a good thing. So the question, I guess, is this: does the money that people are offering farmers and ranchers, does it actually serve as an incentive to actually help them do regenerative projects that they couldn't afford to do otherwise? Or are they paying them to do things that they're already doing? Or what are you seeing?
Great question. So it actually depends on where you are in the U.S. The cost of implementing regenerative ag practices and which regenerative ag practices make sense varies regionally. And so there is no sort of one solution that fits every context. That being said, a lot of the projects that are being developed are in the Midwest and mostly in croplands. And in that case, the cost of implementing new practices often is not fully covered by the carbon market program. But luckily, producers have some other programs at their disposal, including USDA and NRCS programs that help implement conservation practices. Those are really difficult to access sometimes. They're overprescribed. Not all producers have those programs. That being said, a lot of the people participating in carbon market programs today were already doing some form of regenerative ag on their land before they got signed up into the program. And a recent study that just came out last fall that surveyed producers that are participating in carbon market programs, asked them if the financial incentives were the sort of the driving reason they were participating. And many of them said they were already planning on or doing those practices anyway. And so they sort of saw this as cherry on top, an additional income that certainly helped them, but didn't help them transition into this regenerative practice to begin with. Which is interesting because the goal really is to get a lot more people using these kinds of practices across the US and globally. And at least right now, the cost of most credits is not enough and has to be supplemented in other ways to get people sort of across the barrier, the financial barrier. That doesn't mean that there aren't lots of other reasons that people could potentially implement these practices, participate in these programs, but that the carbon payment is not usually enough of a driver.
So what that means is that whether these carbon credits existed or not, the folks who are doing regenerative ag that sequesters carbon, they're already doing them.
That's what this latest study showed, and that's not a big surprise. There are some mechanisms in the carbon protocols and programs that are supposed to prevent that from happening. But the reality is there's a lot of loopholes in how these protocols are constructed, or the instructions for how a carbon credit is generated. It's called a protocol, and how those protocols are constructed can have lots of loopholes to allow early adopters to participate, which again, in and of itself is not a problem. These are people that are, interested in doing more, doing it better, etc. But from a climate perspective, their participation doesn't always mean there's additional carbon sequestration happening.
Right. There have been various exposés in the media about carbon offset projects that weren't what they claimed to be. Basically, people paid money for offsets that didn't really exist. Talk about the certification process or the auditing process or whoever, what are the mechanisms, and I know that they're evolving now, for overseeing and really guaranteeing accountability. In other words, are there people with their feet on the ground working to determine that the carbon credits represent real measurable carbon reduction and sequestration, and also exposing and preventing fraud?
Yes and no. So this gets at some of the interesting comments you made about like the capitalist system and sort of like the drive towards profit. So if you are a voluntary carbon registry it's in your best interest to have lots of projects listed in your registry. You make a little bit of money off the top of each project that a purchase is made from to help sort of fund operations. And there are instructions in the protocols and how a project is validated and how carbon credits are verified to help ensure that the activities are leading to good climate or carbon outcomes. But often the verification activities are what we call desk verification, meaning there are people that go through the paper trail, make sure that they check that, yes, for this producer, they reduced how much fertilizer they purchased, the records from the producer about which fields are in production, what is being planted, when it's being planted. So it's a desk review that essentially just checks the paperwork to make sure that it matches the project documents that were filed. Some small portion of the fields might actually be reviewed using remote sensing, for example, and an even smaller fraction of the fields would be visited in person. That's a really rare kind of a thing, because visiting fields in person, collecting samples, analyzing samples is really expensive. So a lot of the verification happens at the sort of like, are you meeting the basic guidelines of the project? And if the answer is yes, then the project is verified. For projects that use modeling to estimate how much carbon is sequestered, there is a modeling report that is checked by people that have expertise in that type of modeling. But again, it's not a process by which a model is rerun to confirm results. And again, very rarely are the fields actually visited in person, and even rarer is physical soil sampling to confirm the results. So there's a lot of trust that has to go into these programs, and there's also a lot of room for people to take advantage or to not do things to the same level of rigor as a buyer might expect. And there's no single agency that oversees all of this, no single governing body that oversees the voluntary carbon markets and how they are implemented in the US. There is something like that being stood up in Europe, and so there's kind of a drive towards more quality and rigor in Europe, and the US is still a little bit behind in figuring out how that's going to play out here. But nothing like that exists today. So what that means is that a lot of times project developers are policing their own projects, or registries are checking the quality of projects without necessarily having the means to really check every single project thoroughly. And at the same time, there's a lot of reliance on buyers to understand all of the nuances of how a market operates to be able to hold sort of the sellers accountable to the quality of what they're selling, which is a lot of education that's required on the buyer side with no governing body to help really guide the process.
So it's the Wild West.
It's a little bit of the Wild West. That's certainly how it's referred to, especially in the soil carbon space, which is kind of the newer but rapidly growing space.
It's tricky on so many levels, because if you were going to have the kind of rigor that you needed, you would have a lot of boots on the ground, which A, would be super expensive, and B, would have its own carbon footprint. I mean, think of all the people going out to these fields and measuring carbon in the soil and so on. The people who are on the, let's call it the capitalist side, who are selling these carbon credits, they have an incentive to say that people are sequestering tons and tons and tons of carbon, whether they are or not. And then the people who are getting money for that carbon have the same incentive.
Yes.
To say that they're doing that. And so there's no checks and balances.
That's probably the biggest issue. Now, I hope, and I usually think that most of the players in this space, most of the entities in this space are actually trying to make meaningful climate impact and care more about that than they would about the sort of the financial and profit-driven motives that you're talking about. But because many of the companies involved in this space now are backed with venture capital, meaning investors that have very different sort of outcomes that they're driving towards, there's also a tension between the original sort of ideals of a company that started because they want to make climate impact and the fact that they now have impact investors that are looking for particular profit outcomes. So that's also an area of tension. And certainly on the producer side, farmers, I think, generally want to manage their land for long-term sustainability and good outcomes. I don't think there's a tension there. But if they're able to get more money from the carbon market, why wouldn't they? That's just human nature. So I think, again, because of the lack of oversight, we're sort of stuck in this place where there's no there's no way to really know what's going on without going out and measuring, doing lots of measurements, and that just isn't feasible. And we also can't ask farmers and ranchers to go out and collect all of these soils. It's not feasible for them. They're already kind of limited on time. This just isn't something that we can expect.
So the webinar is called the Carbon Credit Conundrum. It's a webinar for farmers and ranchers and anyone else who wants to understand what's going on here. What is the conundrum?
I think the conundrum is really about whether or not carbon markets are a feasible and scalable mechanism for scaling regenerative agricultural practices or soil health management practices. And if farmers and ranchers are being approached by all of these companies, they have a conundrum too, whether or not they should participate, whether or not they can expect to have a pretty big burden of having to provide paperwork. What are the sorts of questions they should be asking in order to decide for themselves if that's a program they want to participate in? So the conundrum is kind of on both sides. From a climate perspective, is this an efficient and meaningful way to actually get climate action? And on the farmer and rancher side, is this a financial opportunity that is real for them and that doesn't add additional burden to what they're already doing? And then if the answer is like this may be a feasible thing, then what are the questions they should be asking as all these opportunities are knocking on their door? What sorts of questions should they ask? What kind of information do they need in order to make an informed decision about which program to participate in? That's the goal.
Very, very interesting. Do you have a sense yourself as somebody who's looking at this and really participating very deeply in understanding this whole world of soil sequestration and carbon credits and offsets and so on, whether this is really an effective tool to, on the balance, reduce carbon emissions and sequester carbon that's in the atmosphere in a real way?
You know, my opinion varies day by day. To be honest, I think there are lots of opportunities for us to improve how land is managed, period, with some climate outcomes and benefits for sure. And if it's that we can get about 5% of our emissions sort of draw down by using these optimal soil management practices, 5% is a really big deal. 5% matters. And so I think we should do everything we can to get that done. The problem I see is in the carbon market or the carbon offset scheme. You have emissions on one side that are very real, sort of like the industrial facility down the street from my house is emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every day. Those emissions are real. If they're purchasing offsets from projects that are not actually delivering the real tons, then the emissions continue to rise and we sort of don't solve the climate equation. So the burden is really on us to make sure that we know that the drawdown, the sequestration is real and that we measure it with rigor and we pay enough for those tons to make it worthwhile for the producers and to make it measurable. And so that's the really big challenge. Right now, the offset market and the price per ton is pretty low, which means we're not really putting enough financial incentive for the producer, and there's not enough money to measure things with rigor. If that price can go up to the point where we can do both with rigor and we know that these things are credible, then I think it could be part of a portfolio of solutions of how we address climate change. It just requires us to do things in a more rigorous way than we are today.
I was thinking about this as kind of a big balance sheet where on the one side, I mean, as you're saying, on the one side you have all the carbon that's being emitted and that has been emitted in the past that's brought the system out of balance. On the other side, you have carbon sinks like regenerative agriculture and forests and so on. And the big question, like the math problem, is are there enough offset projects on planet Earth to actually balance the emissions so that we are drawing down enough carbon to bring the system into balance? Or do we have to really just decarbonize on a massive scale because we don't have even those potential offsets?
Yeah, I think no one is attempting to just offset our way out of our carbon pollution problem. the decarbonization, massive reduction in emissions, and that has to happen in the next 30 years, that has to happen no matter what. This equation is not solved without that. But even if we solve that and we get our emissions down to zero, we are still going to have to remove carbon from the atmosphere because there's legacy carbon or emissions that have been put into the atmosphere over the last 200 years that still have to be removed. And there's inertia baked in the system that is going to mean that we're going to continue to experience warming, even if we eliminate emissions today. That means we have to continue to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And, the natural system is one of the best ways we have today of doing that. I mean, that's literally what trees do. That's what plants do. That's what the ocean does. We have natural systems in place that have been able to keep our climate largely in balance until the last 300 years. So we certainly can make sure that we continue to have those systems in place, but we have to rapidly decarbonize no matter what, or we cannot solve this math problem. And it's not just a math problem. There are real people impacted by the outcomes.
Right. I didn't mean to reduce it to a math problem, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And I guess the question is, you mentioned the number 5% before. How big a role do you think regenerative agriculture can play? Where did that 5% number come from?
Yeah, it's actually, there have been a lot of studies that have kind of estimated how much carbon can be sequestered using soil carbon as the reservoir. And it kind of depends anywhere from 2 to maybe very upper range, 8 gigatons. So we were putting about 40 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere every year. So if we get, 4 gigatons out, that's 10%. But anywhere from 2 to 4 is probably the more reasonable range. That doesn't mean that the potential for that level of sequestration is the same everywhere. There are areas where the soil characteristics, climate, vegetation are just really more favorable to getting more carbon into the soil more quickly, and areas where that's a more challenging endeavor. But globally, at the global scale, it's anywhere from, I would say, 5 to very optimistically 10% of emissions. Probably 5 is the more reasonable number.
So you're director of the Soil Carbon Solutions Center. What is the role of your center in this whole space of carbon credits and offsets?
That's a great question. So as a center here at CSU, we're relatively new, and we focus on bringing lots of different disciplines together under one roof so we can look at this problem from lots of different perspectives and develop solutions that make sense or are scalable and that we can get out into the world more quickly because we're working together across disciplines. For those who are familiar with how academia works, that's not a very common thing. It's challenging. Academia can be really siloed. So we're trying to break those silos and work together in a more interdisciplinary fashion. What that really means is that we work on the fundamental research needed to understand how carbon is sequestered in soil. So there are lots of questions still about that, especially within the context of a changing climate. So things that we sort of knew about soil carbon before are changing because the climate is changing. We also have researchers working on agricultural economics and understanding how these kinds of market mechanisms are affecting behaviors and what people are actually doing in the real world. And we want to make sure that whatever we're developing in terms of tools or approaches to measurement is informed by what people are doing on their farms and ranches and the financial realities of implementing these practices in the real world. We have folks that are working in engineering and developing new tools for measurement of soil carbon in soil or in the lab. We have researchers who are developing models that can better describe what's happening to the soil and to be able to sort of predict how soil carbon is going to change under different management practices. So we're trying to do all of this work individually as researchers at the university and then bringing it all together into one center where we can collaborate more easily and then develop solutions that we can put out into the world more quickly, and not just in peer-reviewed publications that no one reads, but in more accessible things like this webinar that we're planning with Quivira Coalition.
Jane Zelikova is director of the Soil Carbon Solutions Center at Colorado State University. Is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you want to let people know before we go?
I think this webinar is really for anyone who is curious about these opportunities, and there are going to be more and more opportunities like this coming in this space. It's not just for producers, although producers are the main audience. For example, county commissioners that are trying to figure out what's best for their counties, or people who are trying to sort of do extension work, provide technical assistance to producers. It's for everyone that's interested in figuring out how these opportunities are affecting their day-to-day operations. We hope that the information that they get from this webinar series can help them make really informed decisions about how they manage their land going forward.
Jane, thank you so much for being with us on Down to Earth.
Thank you.
To find out more about and to sign up for the free webinar, go to quiviracoalition.org/events. And Quivira is Quivira, quiviracoalition.org/events. You've been listening to Down to Earth. We would love it if you would support this program, which you can do by going to patreon.com/down-to-earth planet to plate, where you can sign up for as little as $3. Patreon is Patreon. And also, please rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. The Quivira Coalition is a not-for-profit and a community network of ranchers, farmers, conservationists, scientists, educators, and many others dedicated to regenerative practices that produce healthy food, support meaningful livelihoods, sustain biodiversity, and remedy the impacts of climate change. To learn more about Quivira and how you can support their work, visit quiviracoalition.org, Quivira. And finally, this show is a production with the Radio Cafe. You can check out radiocafe.org to hear back episodes of this show and also find all kinds of other shows on a wide variety of topics as well. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.